Now, the floor is to Dr. Aline Burni. Aline Burni, she's a political scientist from German Development Institute. Yes, Dr. Aline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Carracas. Can you see my presentation?
Me, I see your presentation.
Okay, great. So I would also like to start by thanking you and the organizers for the invitation.
You have 20 minutes, Dr. Aline, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I will bring a perspective from political science, and I must say that I'm focusing on what we can expect for the future, and I will base it on some recent results of populists in elections and popularity indicators, but I have not conducted very systematic and consistent and forward and longer term research as Funke presented himself. I have conducted research on the case of Brazil, and we found evidence that President Bolsonaro had a significant effect on people's behavior and how people, his supporters in particular, did not follow the health recommendations in reaction to the denialist signals by Bolsonaro. But this is not what I'm focusing today. I will focus on a more comparative and broader perspective, trying to look forward. So much has been said about the pandemic bringing an end to populism, right? However, I agree with other scholars on populism that this claim is too strong to be held, and it is also too early to reach this conclusion because the pandemic is still ongoing. Furthermore, I think it's particularly important to differentiate between what we can expect in the short term and in the long term. We can also expect a different impact of the pandemic across different regions and for different countries as well. And the impact of the pandemic on populism should also be different for those who are in power and in opposition. So my focus will mainly be on what we call the populist radical right parties in Europe, but I will also mention some examples from other countries. Indeed, and as the previous talk has provided us with some insights, some populists in power, they have lost popularity in the context of the pandemic, and this is probably linked to the way that they managed the crisis. There is already some evidence showing that these leaders have been less effective in managing the pandemic, at least when compared to non-populists, but these studies, they tend to focus on cases beyond Europe and generalize from these cases, and they focus on the first wave of the pandemic. So we should be careful on saying that populism itself will be over after the pandemic because of this mismanagement. Actually, not all populists have responded the same way, and the impact of COVID does not seem to be homogeneous on them either. It is also relevant to take into account that in Europe, most populists are in opposition. So when it comes to expectations about the impact of the pandemic in the long term, I believe we can rely on existing studies on populism and the factors that help explain why it emerges. We should look into the root causes and the longer term causes of populism to try to understand what we can expect in the future. These explanations, they usually focus on supply side and demand side factors. And I believe that there are factors in both approaches that can contribute to the resilience of populism in the long term. Therefore, in a nutshell, I do not think that populism will be defeated by the pandemic. The literature points out that in general, crises benefit populists, right? However, when you first look at the impact of this pandemic, at least for populists in government, they seem to have lost some popularity with the rise of COVID deaths, more than non-populist governments. And this is shown in one interesting study by Brett Meyer, who is also a panelist in this symposium. And in addition, we saw that some populist leaders that were in government in the pandemic, they lost elections. So notably the case of Trump in the US. However, in opposition, populist parties have kind of stabilized, or they only lost marginal support. For instance, the AfD in Germany went from about 13% from the last elections in 2017, and now they gathered 10% in 2021. So as has been discussed by the scholarship, at first it seems very difficult for populists to capitalize on the COVID crisis. And why is that? Basically, because it is very hard for them to mobilize against governments and the political establishment during a pandemic. It is challenging to politicize a health crisis and to criticize governments who are experiencing a rally around the flag effect. And it is also hard to work under this logic of people versus the elite, especially when citizens tend to rely on and to trust on expert knowledge to overcome the health outbreak. In addition, there is little room for the salience of populist preferred topics during the pandemic, like immigration and national identity. And the bad performance of prototypical populist leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro have exposed their unpreparedness to deal with such a crisis. So let's start by looking to some recent numbers. When we look to some recent electoral results or polls in Europe, we can see that there's not a clear decreasing support for populist radical right parties. They have lost some support in some cases in the latest elections, for instance, in Germany and in Norway. And according to the polls, they are expected to lose some support in Poland, in Denmark, and France. I'll go back to France in a while. However, they have gained support in other cases, like in Portugal, where this new party, Chega, went from only 1 MP to 12 between two elections. And according to the polls, we can expect significant rises in Italy and Belgium, where the parties are ranking first, as well as more modest ones in Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. In the latest elections in the Netherlands, we saw one right-wing populist party lose some support and another one gaining some. So the overall balance stays the same. And finally, these parties seem to have been more or less stable in Finland, in Greece, and in Hungary. So even in apparent cases of loss, like in France, we need to be cautious to interpret this as a result or as an impact of the pandemic itself. In the case of France, as you know, the traditional populist radical right party led by Marine Le Pen, the Rassemblement National, is now facing another competitor who is in the same camp of Marine Le Pen. So Éric Zemmour, he is recently gathering around 14% of the vote intentions. So in this case, if we were to sum up the expected support that these two candidates are likely to receive in the next presidential elections, according to the polls, we can actually say that the demand for populism has kind of increased in France, and it's now reaching more than 30% of the electorate. Therefore, we see that in cases like this, like France, Italy, and the Netherlands, while support for one more traditional or more established populist radical right party slightly decreased, there are more offers appearing or consolidating in the same side of the ideological spectrum. So this means that overall, we see a stable or even an increased demand for populism in some cases. Now, when it comes to populists in government, they have not faced a homogeneous situation either. It is not clear that the pandemic has consistently weakened their basis. So as I said, Meyer conducted this interesting study about populist leaders in government in Europe and argued that populist-led governments were more likely to be punished by the electorate for the rising of COVID deaths. Nevertheless, when we look beyond Europe, we can remember that even if Trump lost the elections in 2020, he actually increased his popular votes. Trump won more than 70,000 million votes, which is more votes than any other presidential candidate has ever won, with the exception of Biden, of course. So this clearly shows that if Trump lost the election, Trumpism itself is not dead. Similarly, in Brazil, Bolsonaro lost significant popularity during the pandemic. However, despite his consistent denialist approach to the virus and now to the vaccines, he still holds around 30% of positive approvals of his government. And he is expected to run the second round of the upcoming presidential elections in October this year. So in the case of Brazil, we clearly see that Bolsonaro lost some support from the general public, but he clearly maintained his support in his core bases. In India, a similar recent opinion poll revealed that 72% of Indians still want to see Modi as their prime minister in 2024. Therefore, I would say that in a way, populists in government have been resilient despite their mismanagement of the pandemic, at least in these prototypical cases. And in addition to that, going back to Europe, in this recent paper written by Wonders and Mulder, they emphasize that in Europe, it is not clear that these two most pure far-right populist regimes of Hungary and Poland, they actually managed the pandemic very differently or worse than other EU governments. So having looked at these recent trends in popularity, I now would like to go back to some of the key findings of studies on populism that explain the rise and the drivers of populism. And I argue that there are reasons to believe that populism will not end based on the explanations about populism. And this is because some of these explaining factors of populism will likely remain in place even after the pandemic. So it is, of course, hard to make predictions about the future, and I could be wrong, but I think that the pandemic will most likely not bring an end to populism, because some root causes or longer term causes of populism will largely remain in place. And some issues generated or even aggravated by the pandemic, such as job insecurity and rising inequality, they could activate populist support in the future again. So as I said, we need to distinguish between the short-term impact and the longer-term impact of the pandemic. And in the short term, it is true that the pandemic does not seem to favor the popularity of populists. Nevertheless, at least in Europe, as we have seen, where most populists are in opposition, there is not a drastic and clear negative effect of the pandemic either. And on the long run, we could think that populism could rise again based on what the literature says about populism. So first, crises in general help foster support for populists. Both the immigration crisis and the financial crisis have helped populists thrive in Europe, for instance. And the pandemic will likely aggravate some economic and political crises. In fact, some prospects regarding the economy already point to an increasing pressure of inflation, reduction of GDP growth in many countries, rising income inequality, and shocks in the job markets. So beyond this economic crisis itself, in the case of Latin America, for instance, political crisis and corruption scandals usually contribute to the rise of populists. And in the context of the pandemic, corruption has been on the rise in Latin America during the pandemic. Therefore, even if it is difficult for populists to exploit the health crisis itself, this does not mean that they will not find ways to explore new discursive opportunities opened up by economic crisis and political crisis left by the pandemic. Second, and particularly in Europe, the immigration issue will likely return to the agenda at some point. While people's attitudes towards migration may not be particularly impacted by the pandemic, we know that the increasing salience of cultural issues like immigration and national identity, they are a factor explaining the success of populist radical right parties. In addition, the choices made by mainstream parties on these topics also play a role for the rise of populism. And I think it is unlikely to say that the overall debate and the narrative on migration in Europe would suddenly take a positive turn. Third, the pandemic introduced more and new uncertainties about the future. These uncertainties, they can open up new discursive opportunities for populism, which is by definition chameleonic, and it adapts to the circumstances in order to exploit the failures of the system, raise criticism of the establishment, and mobilize people's frustrations. An example that illustrates how populists can mobilize these new issues that resonate with the audience is the anti-vax movements, which are being captured and mobilized by populist parties around the world, especially as a way to oppose governments in place and restrictions regarding the COVID-19. And their oppositions, as we've seen lately, their opposition to vaccines and to the new containment measures, they have been framed as a defense of freedom discourse. Then focusing more on the demand side, economic and cultural grievances, as we know, and demands of citizens also help explain the rise of populism. And many of these conditions will likely remain in place even after the pandemic. On the economic side, explanations have focused on how globalization, neoliberalism, technological changes, and others have generated discontent and divisions among the electorate by making life more insecure, and in particular for some underprivileged and more vulnerable groups. Increases in income and wealth inequality have also been linked to rising preferences for populist parties. And as a whole, these economic developments have made many voters resentful and susceptible to populists who scapegoat and vilify elites and the establishment. On the cultural side, the literature has argued that rising fears of migration, the decline of traditional values, and the mobilization of women and minority groups are also major drivers of populism. And this means that the perception of group-based identity threats has led some voters to support politicians that promise to protect their own group status and their own identity. Of course, that these cultural and economic factors, they in reality interact to each other. And in that sense, studies have consistently found that xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments, and out-group resentments tend to rise during difficult economic times. Therefore, considering that the pandemic amplifies uncertainties with regards to unemployment and future job prospects, it is possible that economic insecurity will also intensify sentiments of resentment against outgroups and more attachment to in-groups. And as a final point, populism is also a consequence of what we call the crisis of representation. Over the last years, the electorate has become overall more volatile, and the attachments to political parties have drastically decreased. This suggests that the observed rally around the flag effect around parties in government that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, they can well be temporary too. And following the similar reasoning, the assumed lack of trust on populists in power because of the mismanagement of the pandemic could also be sporadic too. So in conclusion, the COVID pandemic does not mean that populism will decrease its force and its popular appeal. What we observe so far are some specific popularity losses in some cases, but the impact of the pandemic is not homogeneous and so far has been, as a rule, very modest. While in the short term, the pandemic has not been capitalized by populists, in the long term, both demand side and supply side factors that explain support for populists will more likely remain in place after the pandemic. As a whole, the prolonged economic crisis can create new conditions and open up new discursive opportunities for populists. And the rising uncertainty can amplify cultural and economic grievances that traditionally help explain the rise of populism. In addition, cultural issues can become salient again in the future. So this does not mean to say that populism will stay the same. It could be that post-COVID populism looks different from what it is now. In fact, in some countries, we have seen emerge new and more radical offers of populism, like in France. Finally, these cases of radicalization raise one important question about the relevance and the level of preciseness of the term populism. And I think this is an important point that has been already raised by scholars of populism. For instance, Casmudo has more often used the term far right rather than populism. But this will, of course, be a topic for another discussion. And so far, the pandemic will leave us with the challenge of populism and with the need to confront to new old questions like these ones about the preciseness of the term of populism. But this is a topic for another debate. Thank you.